Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel today in our first unit here of 2:1 to 5:5 as we enter chapter 3, which alternates, as we can see in our first scene, between the call of a long war between the house of Saul and David, and interestingly, David having a series of sons, each by different wives. So we'll look at that and also what follows as Abner decides to take things into his own hands as we continue. So today we're going to be looking at this first part here, the war between the houses, and then Abner and Ishbaal there. As we do, we've been noting some of the connection between this unit and what we'll see in 15 to 19, chapters 15 to 19 in Absalom's rebellion. In particular, here is around the issue of the king's quote-unquote concubines, we'll use a different word for that, that are entered as a claim to the throne, here by Abner and then later by Absalom, as we'll see. And a number of parallels, as we looked at before, between Ishbaal and Absalom, although Absalom is obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, maybe you're not as familiar with the story, but is an active participant in trying to seek to take his father's place, whereas Ishbaal is much more passive and is being manipulated by Abner, as we'll see in today's scene. And you can see a number of these other things that are parallel. I'll point them out as we go. There are not as many key words, but there are a few important key words. And that has to do with house, which we'll see a number of times in the following chapters, especially in chapter 7, the many plays on house. And we see multiple plays on it here, because there's the question of the house of Saul and the house of David, but there's also the question of the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and how those relate to each other or don't. And we'll see more about that as we go. There's also, and I've translated consistently here, although New RSV translates the Hebrew verb in different ways, for making a covenant here, and various things that aren't translated as make, to highlight that things are being made. A monarchy is being made, and a potential succession is being made through the children that are named here, even though David is obviously going to be king for a while, and we're finding out exactly how long he was as king, 7.5 years over Israel, over Judah and Hebron, and 40 years over them both, the rest of it in Jerusalem, as we've seen. So another thing that we're going to see that I think is interesting and raises something for authors, or interpreters rather, authors of modern commentary, who see this story as a composition made up of different pieces from different time periods. And perhaps that goes to this question, but maybe it goes to something else, which is all the different ways in which the people who either claim it affirmatively or willing to abide by David's royal authority in these opening chapters are named all these different ways. And plainly, these are not all different names for the same thing. But we heard tribes of Israel once, and we won't hear tribes of, back in 1 Samuel rather, and we won't hear tribes of Israel other than 5:1 all the way until it's parallel in the Absalom story. We see house of Israel here, again contrasting with house of Saul and house of David here. But then we also will see elders of Israel, and we only see them in a couple of places. First, two places in 1 Samuel when they ask for a king in the first place, and then later here in 2 Samuel, but in these immediate places here. All the people, and 54 times in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 13 times in these chapters. Are all the people the same as the house of Israel? Or they combine the house of Judah? Which all the people do we mean? Then all Israel that we'll see in 5:5, but it's 33 times in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Is all Israel the same as the house of Israel? Is it the same as the tribes of Israel? Then there's the chosen men of Israel, which certainly seems to overlap David's or the king's men, but are they the same? The chosen men of Israel are the ones that worked for Saul back in 1 Samuel 26 and over against David's men, so we're going to see how that plays out. And then finally, Yahweh's people, Israel. So all these different titles, which it's easy for modern readers just to slip by and go, oh, they're just talking about something called Israel. But maybe, maybe not. And one of the things we're going to be looking at in these chapters is, what exactly do the authors mean by Israel or by Judah? Do they mean a political entity, an ethnic group, a geographic description, a family lineage, or something else? And the issue of tribes and house and elders all plays into that. So let's begin to look at our scene here, and then we'll look at a couple other things that we have noted as we get there. So these first 6 verses, as you can see in the note below, but I can put it up here so you can see it bigger, form a nice, neat little chiasm, framing the birth of children around the question of war. And let's look at some of the details, because there's a lot going on that'd be easy to skip past. A long war, Milchama here, continuing from what we saw in 2:17, with the battle by the pool and the symbolic war between all of them who died there. But here as the house of Saul and the house of David. So is it a civil war? Is this one unit that's divided into two? They're only connected if they are connected by a sense of Yahweh, but we have not noticed that those were connected at all. And the house of David is something we're seeing new here. So as my note below has, the house of David and the house of Saul, affiliated with Hebron and Mahanaim, respectively, and distinguished from Judah and Israel, are crucial to the story of David as king. In 2 Samuel 3:1, as we see here, the house of Saul and the house of David characterize two political groups fighting for rule over Israel. And the house of David is independent from the notion of the larger polity of Judah, just as the house of Saul is distinct from Israel, and that from Mari Fleckman there. So she wrote a whole dissertation on these chapters, and we'll be looking at that more as we go. So she's noting the distinctive from the larger polity of Judah and house of Saul from Israel, and we'll look more closely as the text unfolds. So David grew stronger and stronger. That's a new RSV rendering the strong word here. And the only other time for that is in Exodus 19:19. We see there as a blast of a trumpet grew louder and louder, but never otherwise for people. So notice it says David, not the house of David, but David grew stronger while the house of Saul became weaker. Plainly, it can't be Saul who's growing weaker because Saul is dead. So the house of Saul here represented by Ishbaal or Ishbosheth, depending on the translation. Obviously, we know that Jonathan is dead as well. And we don't know of other sons, although we know of daughters. We know of Mishal and Merab. So we'll find out more about those as we go. And this is the plural construct here, Vidalium here, so the word dal, to highlight the doubling there. As we see from my note below, an example of political propaganda shaping the reader's perception of a past that, at least among some quarters of the population, might have been told rather differently. And this raises a question that I've been exploring throughout, and it really comes to a head here in the issue of David becoming king, which is to say, what is the relation between the narrative here and actual history? And I've studied a number of recent books on this question, and they almost all disagree with each other, and I won't go over all those details. But the primary view of many is that yes, there was a David, and yes, there was some kind of monarchy in the 10th century of the time period of the story, but many suggest that the actual narrative we have wasn't written until much later, until Assyria was an issue in the 8th century. And yet I want to ask readers or watchers of my videos as we go here, as we evaluate the question of who is the audience. Is the audience contemporaneous with the events, trying to justify David, or is the audience something later, creating a past for the sake of a future audience? In other words, constructing a past that didn't exist. If so, then why all this detail? Why all the detail of these wives and children, many of whom we never hear from again, some of whom we will, of course. Amnon and Adonijah will be important, but Chileab is not, and Absalom is. So why all those extra details? We don't see that about other kings in the story, and we don't see that about Saul. We only see about his son Jonathan and the two daughters that are important, as I've noted. So just a question we need to ask. So we note that these are sons born to David at Hebron, and then we'll see in chapter 5 sons born to him in Jerusalem. And so while the war is raging, David has children. And that raises an interesting question about, is he leading a war? What war exactly is this? We don't see any narration of battles. We just saw the battle around the pool of Gibeon, which is not even really a battle. It was just a mutual suicide, as we saw there. So it's not clear exactly what this war looks like. It is a war of propaganda. We'll see Abner taking his part in it in just a moment. So let's just go over this briefly here. As my note has, if there are daughters like Tamar, who we know there'll be a daughter, they're not mentioned. She's named in chapter 13, apart from the list, as if we already know about her, but we don't. And the firstborn, using Bakor there, a word that's used for Esau in Genesis, and there are many parallels between our story here in Genesis, as we'll see, and the role of Esau as Edom will come up later, but not right now. But the firstborn was Amnon. And the issue here would be, of course, is the firstborn the one who's entitled to be the successor? And so far, that's not been the case. So far, what we've seen in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is not the establishment of a Yahweh-inspired dynasty, but a monarchy where every holder of the kingship would be selected by Yahweh separately. plainly David is not a descendant of Saul, and he's chosen separately. And we saw that Yahweh picked him and the people affirmed him, and so that's the process we're seeing here. But there's no sense in what we've seen so far that any of David's sons should expect that they get to succeed their father. And yet this is a pointing ahead to what we know, that Amnon is the firstborn. And of Ahinoam, who, as we've noted before, is likely Saul's wife, although it's never quite said that way. As Baruch Halper notes below, how Nathan's parable on 2 Samuel 12:8, after the Bathsheba incident, notes in the plural the giving to David of Saul's women and the fact of Jezreel in the north, the scene of Saul's last battle from 1 Samuel 29:11. Hence, Amnon is a partial Saulite because his mother is Saul's mother, according to Halpern's view, and thus part of David's plan to dispatch the house of Saul. She, Ahinoam, is last mentioned here. And that's an interesting theory because Amnon will die at the hand of his brother Absalom, ostensibly for raping Amnon's half-sister and Absalom's full sister. But part of what Halpern's suggesting is that's all a cover-up to get rid of the house of Saul. And we'll have to evaluate that as we go too. So then we come to the second Chileab, who's not mentioned again, and connected with Abigail, who's always named as the widow of Nabal of Carmel, always named there, as we've seen back there, and this is the last time we'll see that. The third, Absalom, and there's an interesting piece here that's worth paying close attention to. So son of Maacah, this is not a wife according to 2:2, but we'll look at it more closely, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. There's a question if this is the same person as at Judges 1:10. We can look there. They defeated Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, but there's not enough information to know there. But Geshur here is recalling a notice at Joshua 13:13. I won't go back, the only previous mention of Geshur. This is contrary to Deuteronomy, which says all these people must be destroyed. But that's part of my argument that that argument in Deuteronomy, as many scholars would say, is from the 7th century and comes later with the idea that all the Canaanites are an infection that have to be destroyed. As my note below says, Geshur was a small Aramean kingdom located in southern Golan on one of the routes that connected the Bashan with the Phoenician coast. It must have maintained its independence in the time of these other people, and we don't need to worry about those details now. But what's important is it's going to come up later because Absalom will go there later to him to hide, as we'll see when he's running away from David. So the fourth, Adonijah, who will be the one who claims to be the successor, all on his own. We know nothing about his mother Hagoth here, and she's mentioned there in association with his attempt. Shephatiah we know nothing about, and the mother here, Abital, or the father as the case may be, we know nothing about. The sixth, Ephraim we know nothing about, or David's woman Eglah we know nothing about, meaning cow, interestingly. She's named as a woman here, the others are not. These were born to David in Hebron, and then the end of the chiasm. And I want to note here that this is setting up something that many male scholars don't pay attention to, but I want to pay attention to and detail here, which is how women are trapped by power and patriarchy in 2 Samuel. These women have no role here whatsoever other than to give David a son. And they're named only for that reason. And even though we saw earlier that Abigail was a strong character back in 1 Samuel 25, now she's simply another womb like these others. And so they're known only for producing David's sons. We don't know how they feel about it. We don't know how David acquired all these other women. And then we're going to see in verse 7 here, Saul had translated here a concubine, but a Pilagesh, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Named Rizpah, and so we see her there where Abner has seemingly non-consensual sex with her to send a message about his desire to be king. And then we'll see similarly with Michal, the daughter of Saul, who had already been given to David, taken away, and will be given back, even though her man Paltiel follows and cries, and he's just told to go home. So both he and Michal are just taken, whether it's with their will or against their will. There's the unnumbered group of women who are taken by David to produce more children. We know nothing about them. Most famously, Bathsheba, who David takes and has sex with and has her husband killed. Tamar, who we just mentioned, David's daughter, who was raped by her half-brother Amnon, and David does nothing about it right away. The wise woman of Tekoa, who is not involved in a sexual scandal, but is forced into deceptive service by Joab and could easily be killed if David didn't understand what was happening. And then these other women, often described as concubines, I'm going to call them secondary women here, of David, who were forced by David to guard the king's house during the rebellion. And then later Absalom seemingly has involuntary sex with them. And I put the question, the exclamation mark, because it says he went into them, and I'm not sure if we're supposed to understand an orgy or just that he went into one of them, but that's how it's described there. So we're going to really raise attention to all these women here, as Deacon Lauer did in the cover picture, and I can put it up here, of Rizpah. This is the scene of her later in chapter 21 when her sons are killed as part of the final ending of the house of Saul. So, Pelagesh, as I noted here, and let's look at that because that's where we're at. Let's go down a couple of verses just to finish seeing our scene here. So Pelagesh, and more modern translators refer to this as a secondary woman or wife. I don't like wife because there's no Hebrew word for wife. So it's not a concubine in that sense, but it is a woman of just lesser status than the primary woman. And yet their children count as descendants just as they did for Rachel and Leah's Pelageshot there when Jacob had children through them. They count as the tribal leaders. So there's no sense that they're secondary at all in that sense. So the ones that are in red here are Saul's, and the ones who are in blue here are David's. And we can see how they're simply used here. They have no voice and they have no function other than to be used by these men. So let's look at the scene here of Abner and Ishbaal briefly here. So Saul has this Pelagesh, whose name is Rizpah, daughter of Ai. Ai is only mentioned in Genesis 36 as a male Edomite, and that's one of the many connections here. And Ishbaal said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" And notice that he's saying something that we don't know has happened. It's happened after the fact, apparently, and he's objected to it. Did he see it happen? Did he hear rumors of it happen? We don't know. When Absalom does it, he does it on the roof of the house so everybody can see. So we don't know if Abner did it just for Ishbaal's benefit or publicly. It's interesting that the writers describe Ishbaal's response rather than Abner's action. And the Wahi, the Madu here, the neutral Hebrew Y, in contrast to the negative Lama. But as Halper notes, all the same, the question represents a grave accusation, which is to say he's calling Abner on Abner's attempt to take the place of the father, using the woman and intercourse with her as symbolic power there. It's not exactly like the hieros gamos in agricultural empires where there's a woman designated to have sex with the king in order to symbolize the god's provision of fertility. This isn't about fertility. This is simply about power, and sexuality is power. And we'll see that playing out in a different form when Rehoboam tries to get power for himself after he succeeds his father Solomon. So why have you gone in using a crude word here, and as Willa Gaffney notes, she was a casualty to the messy, bloody business of king-making. Gone in could suggest raping, and it certainly doesn't suggest any kind of consent. Notice, to my father's concubine, not his. His father's dead, so his father doesn't have any secondary wife at this point, but he's not claiming it for himself. He could have claimed her for himself, but he doesn't. And Abner's response is anger because Ishbaal plainly doesn't get it, the insolent young man that he is. As Gaffney notes again below, his scheme was not to put himself on the throne, but to make himself indispensable to the inevitable monarch. By declaring for David, he identifies as a garden variety rapist, not a throne-usurping rapist. He is given a pass. The rape of Rizpah is unavenged. And as we'll see in chapter 21, in the end, her 5 sons are also murdered. So the words of Ishbaal made Abner very angry, Mayad adding the extremity to it. And we're going to see more anger just coming up in chapter 6, anger around the ark, as we'll see, and David's anger as well. But right now it's Abner's anger. And his response is something that can be translated one of two ways, as we have it here in the NORSV, am I a dog's head for Judah? Or as Poulsen suggested, given that the word for dog is Caleb, and Caleb was the house out of which Nabal came, as we see down here. So he suggests, am I the head of Caleb, which belongs to Judah? So rather than being a sense of a self-insult, that Ishmael is insulting Abner and he's naming it as suggesting you're calling me a dog's head, it's a more political statement that am I actually the head of the family of Caleb, which he's not, for Judah. Either way, he says, today I've been making, not showing, I keep making chesed. And I want to highlight Hesed here because Hesed is almost always otherwise a word for God's attitude toward human beings. Translated, as you can see here, faithfulness, covenant loyalty, divine kindness, steadfast love. It's hard to render in a simple English phrase. Sometimes associated with emet, for truth, or Chesed ve'emet, as a full form as a hendiadys there. But I've left it translated the way the RSV does, so you can see that in we might call secular or royal situations, or just friendships, we can see it translated here as in David and Jonathan's covenant relationship with each other. But as we see here, David sending messengers about Yahweh showing Hesed to the people of Jabesh Gilead. Here we see it here, but we'll see it in other places as we go, in relation to human relationships, but also into divine relationships as well. But a key word to describe this, and usually relating to something like loyalty out of a commitment. So I've been making Hesed to the house of your father Saul, to his brothers, whoever they are, we don't know anything about them, and to his friends or companions, which could certainly mean his political companions or people that are on his side, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me now with a crime concerning this woman, or it could be translated, you have found fault with me or guilt about this. And of course he hasn't. He simply asked the question, why have you gone in? And it was, I noticed, a neutral question. It wasn't an accusatory form, and yet Abner's not stupid. He understands what's happening here. And so he reaches the logical conclusion. So may God do to Abner, a phrase we'll see at the end of the chapter, and we'll see in its parallel in chapter 19 out of the mouth of David, do to Abner, and so maybe add to it a generic phrase without any specific content. For just what Yahweh has sworn to David, that I will make for him. How does Abner know, as Baden notes here, how does Abner know about what Yahweh has sworn to David? Abner's been working for Saul, and he would know that David is Saul's anointed from the scene that we saw back in the cave, but we don't know that he heard anything specific that Yahweh has sworn, and yet he's citing that to Ishmael here. And what it is to transfer, or literally to Hebrew, aver, to cross over the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David. Notice again, not parallel, not the house of Saul and the house of David, but from the house of Saul here to the throne of David, or literally the seat of David, first here in 2 Samuel. And we see it a number of times, as you can see, in Kings throughout. The idea of the throne as a seat of power only emerges in the succession. So now it's to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, not the house of Judah earlier. So we'll have to explore what those differences are. From Dan to Beersheba. And this is a phrase from before the monarchy, the boundaries of Israel, as we saw all the way back in 1 Samuel 3:20, and we see it here in its parallel, and we'll see it again later. And Ishmael could not answer, or more strongly, could not prevail or endure against him because he was afraid of him. So Ishmael, being an example of the weakness of the house of Saul, can say nothing to Abner, and now it's Abner's turn to see if he can find support in the house of David. We'll see what happens when he goes there next time. See you then.